So in August 1947, when Britain quits the subcontinent, it divides it into the modern-day states of India and Pakistan. It leads, of course, to horrific amount of killing. An estimated 1 million people are killed in the partition violence that follows. And also an estimated 13 million people are forced to migrate across the newly established national borders of India and Pakistan. Indeed, the partition is seen as the defining moment in the history of modern India. Now, how and why did this happen is a question which historians begin to address some, 20, 30 years after this event happens. And indeed, this investigation of an inquiry into this question is also facilitated by the publication of documents by Her Majesty's Stationery Office, which are printed in these massive 12 transfer of power volumes. And in this regard, the most seminal work was done by the historian Ayesha Jalal, who in her book, The Sole Spokesman, asked the question, how is it that Pakistan, which came into existence, served the interests of Muslims so poorly for whom it was really established? Now, Jalal, in addressing the question, looks through Mr. Jinnah's angle of vision and comes out with a particular thesis. And the argument that Jalal makes is that Mr. Jinnah did not really want a Pakistan in the first place. That was not his topmost priority. That indeed he was using it as some kind of a bargaining counter to gain for the Indian Muslims political equality with the more numerous, preponderant Hindu majority in an undivided India. Mr. Jinnah, therefore, keeps the idea of Pakistan fairly vague, doesn't quite define it, according to Jalal. But in the negotiations which happen over the transfer of power, things go awry. And indeed, what is suggested is that it is indeed the leadership of the Indian National Congress which, in its quest for a centralized state, which rams down the partition option through Mr. Jinnah's throat. Now, the focus of the historiography, which therefore emerges in the wake of Jalal, is indeed on the high politics of the partition. An immediate response to Jalal happens a few years later in an Oxford thesis written by the historian Anita Inder Singh, in which, of course, she tries to push back against the Jalal thesis, arguing that indeed there was nothing terribly vague about Pakistan that Mr. Jinnah was aspiring for, that he wanted a separate sovereign nation, and indeed very skillfully outmaneuvered both a war-weary British establishment and a tired old Congress leadership to achieve a goal that he had set out to achieve, which is a separate Pakistan. However, there is a consensus when it comes to this historiography on the high politics of the partition, which is both agree that Pakistan remains this very vague idea about which nobody really is very clear about. And as Ayesha Jalal herself writes, and I quote, a host of conflicting shapes and forms, most of them vague, were given to what remained little more than a catch-all and undefined slogan. If Jalal says this, even though Anita Inder Singh disagrees from her, Inder Singh also claims that Pakistan remained a vague idea for most people and that it meant all things to all Muslims. Now, if you look at the regional studies of the Pakistan movement, especially focusing on Pakistan movement in the provinces of Punjab and Bengal that were partitioned as well, here too, the idea that one gets is that what you see is a rather insufficient and uncertain comprehension of this idea of Pakistan. And finally, to come to subaltern histories, and here in this regard, Gyan Pandey, one of the subaltern historians who's worked on this area, who is a fierce critic of great man history, and also the concurrent tendency to reduce South Asian history to the biography of the nation state. He has generally tended to foreground fragmentary histories involving ordinary Hindus and Muslims, possessing unpartitioned selves, several life worlds, and also having a topping of hard-nosed political rationality. Pandey too claims that even though he's pushing back against the great man history or the elite historiography on the partition, claims that, and I quote, the Muslims had fairly widely supported the movement for Pakistan, though as was becoming evident, few had clear ideas as to what that goal meant. Now, if you look at the newest wave of partition studies, which focus on the experience of women, refugees, survivors of the partition, what you also see is indeed explorations of how these people were caught up in a wave of horrific violence, couldn't make sense of what was happening around them as their worlds collapsed as a result of unfathomable decisions taken at the top. Indeed, this anthropological term has also been accompanied by an increasing literature, by an increasing focus on partition literature and cinema, now deemed more suitable for articulating the pain, suffering, and the displacement caused by the partition. It also marks a critique of the historian's history that seems to have been primarily concerned with mapping the biography of the nation state, endlessly searching for the causes of the partition, its villains apportioning praise and blame, an endeavor which is now deemed futile, if not puerile. So partition, by all accounts, seems to have happened in a fit of South Asian collective absent-mindedness, the tragic end result of a transfer of power negotiations gone awry, hastily midwifed by a war-weary Britain, eager to get out of the morass of an imploding empire, leaving the unsuspecting millions to face the brutal consequences. In the wake of this common sense about the partition, what has also been said is that given Pakistan's emergence in the context of a sharp disjuncture between the inchoate aspirations of the Indian Muslim masses and the secret politics of the political elites, scholars following in the train of Benedict Anderson have explained Pakistan as an insufficiently imagined state. It has thus been argued that the two-nation theory, while being spectacularly successful in rallying the Indian Muslims to the cause of Pakistan, was not really accompanied by any concrete program around which the nation could coalesce after its realization. Instead, it has been alleged that Pakistan rallies resounded with a popular but vague slogan, Pakistan ka matlab kya, la ilaha illallah, meaning what is the meaning of Pakistan? There is no God but God, the implication being that Pakistan was not articulated any further beyond emotional slogans of this kind. Yet, it begs an important question. If we are to assume that India is an argumentative society, to kind of use Amartya Sen's phrase, how can something like Pakistan remain a vague idea or just an emotional slogan about which most people seem to have not much of an understanding? And that's the question that I ask in my own work. I therefore look at how the idea of Pakistan is articulated, debated in the public sphere, and how popular mobilization happens for the purpose of attaining this goal. And in this regard, I look at the trajectory of the Pakistan movement in the province of UP in North India, a province which is not going to be a part of Pakistan. And if you look at the debates in UP, it is clear that some of these people writing on Pakistan are clear that the UP is not going to be a part of Pakistan. And yet, whether Pakistan should be created or it should not be, that becomes the focus of the whole debate. And I argue that the way the Muslim League articulates the idea of Pakistan, it portrays it as a sovereign nation state. Indeed, at many places, it is portrayed as an ideal Islamic state, a second Medina, the first being the Medina created by the Prophet 1300 years earlier, that this is going to be an Islamic utopia in which, of course, what you will see is a revival and renaissance as far as Islam is concerned in the 20th century, that Pakistan would also emerge as the most powerful Islamic state in the world, which would indeed take up the leadership of the global community of Muslims and indeed emerge as a worthy successor to the defunct Ottoman Caliphate, which had dropped the baton as far as the leadership of the global Muslim world is concerned at the end of World War I. Now, this articulation regarding Pakistan by the Muslim League, of course, is severely contested in the UP, and that is also something that I try to kind of bring up in this work. So there is, of course, a longing for Pakistan, to kind of pick up the phrase, or rather the theme of this seminar, which is not that inchoate, and it is also contested. And what you also have are alternative longings as to what a possible post-British future in the subcontinent is going to look like. The debate in the public sphere is initiated by B.R. Ambedkar, somebody whom we kind of do not quite associate with Pakistan. We tend to see him as, of course, an icon for the Dalit movement in India, especially as it kind of gains traction in the 80s and 90s. But Ambedkar is, as he later claims, is the original philosopher of Pakistan. He claims that. He says, I was the first philosopher of Pakistan. That can be contested, of course, but Ambedkar is somebody who really sets the ball rolling as far as public discussions, debate on the question of Pakistan is concerned. So his thoughts on Pakistan, which is published in early 1941, indeed Ambedkar he signs off the preface on 25th December 1940. And if you read the preface, Ambedkar tells you that, well, if you look at it, the Lahore Resolution is passed in late March 1940. And by August, he's done writing this Thoughts on Pakistan, a remarkable, nearly 400-page volume. Yeah, so it takes, a lot of your graduate students or people who have written books, it takes us years, and this man produces this in 3 months. A remarkable effort. And it becomes a kind of a roadmap. It will be, Ambedkar's work will be cited by both Gandhi and Jinnah when they meet for their summit meeting in 1944 to kind of discuss and try and resolve the communal question in India. Ambedkar lays out what is at stake as far as the question of Pakistan is concerned. I will try and briefly kind of go through some of the arguments that Ambedkar raises in his thoughts on Pakistan. The first thing that Ambedkar does is he tries to clarify what the Lahore Resolution is all about, especially given the fact that the phrasing of the Lahore Resolution is somewhat loose, as Ambedkar himself points out. Ambedkar makes it clear that if you boil down the Lahore Resolution, what it means is that the Muslim majority provinces in the west and in the east, that is Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan, Frontier Province, and Bengal in the east, will be incorporated as independent states outside of British India. And that, he says, is the sum and substance of the Lahore Resolution. Now, Ambedkar, if you look at his book, does not go into the question of Pakistan's economic viability, its political military viability, but narrowly focuses on the question of whether or not Pakistan is a nation. In a very short section of the book, if you look at the entire book, a small section of the book is focused on addressing this question. And Ambedkar is clear that the Hindus need to come, and he's addressing himself to the Congress and the Hindus. And Ambedkar presents himself as a clear-eyed, hard-headed realist, asking the Hindus and the Congress, who are being rather starry-eyed or idealists, to kind of have a good, hard look at this question of Pakistan, or indeed the Muslim League's demand. Ambedkar claims that the Hindus needed to come to terms with the fact that the Muslims had developed the will to live as a separate nation, which meshed with the happy coincidence of nature having found them a territory that they could occupy. Indian Muslims were not content to occupy the same position as the French in Canada and had demanded a separate national existence, and therefore there was no way in which the Hindus could deny to the Muslims what they themselves were asking of the British, that is, a separate or sovereign national existence. Ambedkar, of course, went on to demolish what he called sentimental Hindu objections to Pakistan. He argued that the Hindus and Muslims did not have a common past. Indeed, as he very starkly put it, they were like two armed battalions, historically warring against one another throughout history, and that the few commonalities that they had were the result of a dead past that had no present or a future. Ambedkar therefore wanted to ask the Hindus to get real on the question of Pakistan, and here the most important question that he asked them to consider was the question of India's defense. Here he pointed out that the Indian army was predominantly Muslim. Whether or not Ambedkar's figures are right is kind of debatable. But here too, he also pointed out that most of these Muslim soldiers in the Indian army were from the Northwest Frontier Province and Punjab. And then he asked this question, which is also, this example, this hypothetical example, is also raised by Muslim League leadership through the campaign for Pakistan, especially in UP. And so Ambedkar asked this question: how would these soldiers react in case India was attacked by Afghanistan, or if India indeed decided to invade Afghanistan? And here Ambedkar gives a very stark answer in response to this question. He says that Muslim soldiers would rather join their Afghan brethren than defend India, and would disobey orders if India were to launch an invasion of Afghanistan. As he went on to say, the Mussalman accepts only the European as his superior and sees the Hindu as his inferior. And the Mussalman of the Northwest was the most disaffected against the Hindus in all of India, and most susceptible to pan-Islamist sentiments. Ambedkar therefore wanted the Hindus and the Congress to decide whether they wanted the Mussalmans without and against, or if they should be within and against, as he put it. The best option, he said, was to concede Pakistan, and as he noted, it was a consummation devoutly to be wished that the Muslims should be without. And as he went on to assure the Hindus, the defense of India, far from being weakened, would be infinitely improved by it. Besides the question of the Indian army, which Ambedkar felt needed to be a loyal army which could secure the borders of this nation state. Ambedkar then moved on to a second reason why he felt that the Pakistan demand needed to be conceded given the enormous and overwhelming support that it enjoyed among the Indian Muslims. Ambedkar pointed out that if indeed Pakistan were not conceded, the communal problem in India would continue to fester. It would perhaps also worsen. And for Ambedkar, the resolution of the communal problem could be, or the communal problem could be largely resolved if partition were to be, if partition were to be kind of gone through. And here, Ambedkar was very, very clear that the partition that he had in mind was the partitioning of the provinces of Punjab and Bengal. And here, he's very, very clear that the partition has to happen on the basis of numbers so that the Muslim majority districts were to go to Pakistan, whereas, the non-Muslim majority districts were to come into India. And here too, Ambedkar comes up with another startling, very startling kind of a suggestion, not just a suggestion, he calls for it. He says that what you should also consider is transfers of population between India and Pakistan for the purpose of achieving national homogeneity and also for really minimizing the communal problem to the greatest possible extent. In this regard, he also pointed out that, well, Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria had managed it, and there was no reason why this could not be managed in the case of the Indian subcontinent. Of course, this was going to be voluntary, as Ambedkar said, and that it could happen as a result of management by the states of India and Pakistan. Ambedkar, of course, also was clear that those Congress politicians who thought that Mr. Jinnah was using Pakistan as a bargaining counter, he said, were basically indulging in wishful thinking. He believed that this was a very real demand and that Mr. Jinnah was not bluffing in any possible way here. Ambedkar goes on to then lay out other reasons why partition should be consummated. As he puts it, if it is not gone through, India will become the sick man of Asia, just like Turkey had become the sick man of Europe. Here, the next thing that Ambedkar looks at, it would be what, the internal political situation in India, if indeed partition was not gone through. And here, Ambedkar says that the Congress needs to stand up to the Muslim League's very aggressive tactics, as he calls it, their communal aggression. As he says, if indeed the Congress were not to accede to a partition and come to some kind of a compromise with the Muslim League would end up demanding and also getting a 50% share in everything, reducing the Hindus to a minority, and also cutting into the rights of other minorities in India. And I presume he had in mind his own constituency of untouchables, or the community that we call Dalit today. Ambedkar is really harsh in this regard, calling the Muslim League, comparing the Muslim League's propaganda to Nazi propaganda. And as he says, the Muslim League was speaking the language of Hitler and claiming a place in the sun which Hitler had been claiming for Germany. For the demand for 50% in everything was but a counterpart of the German claims to Deutschland über alles and Lebensraum. Ambedkar also goes on to argue against the imposition of Urdu all over India, a demand which is made by the Muslim League, saying that the language of 28 million could not be foisted over 322 million people in India. Finally, Ambedkar also said that, or Ambedkar at least in this book, points out that the Muslim League's political program seems to give importance to religion over all other secular categories of life. namely the differences between the rich and the poor, capital and labor, priest and layman, reason and superstition. These were basically subordinated, and what Muslim League's politics did was that it was essentially clerical and recognized only one difference, namely that between the Hindus and the Muslims. Partition was therefore the best remedy. Now, this is a very brief kind of an overview of what Ambedkar is doing in his book. And the question remains, how is the Muslim League going to respond to this book, which has called for the granting of the Muslim League's demand of Pakistan, but done it in a manner which would hardly be music to the supporters of the Muslim League, because in a way what it has hinted is that Pakistan, even though it's not going to be viable, or rather it's not going to be viable in many ways. Economically it may be weak, politically, militarily it may be a rather weak state, but as Ambedkar believes, that should not be something that the Congress should be considering, that Pakistan should be conceded, so that this communal problem in India is kind of settled to the greatest possible extent. Now, if the Muslim League has to kind of counter Ambedkar, it has to come up with a set of arguments which show that Pakistan is not just going to be not just a viable state in an economic, military, political sense, but also going to be a really powerful state, a significant actor on the world stage. And therefore, the Muslim League therefore comes up with its own propaganda materials, which I kind of look at also in the book. And in this regard, two volumes which come up, Pakistan and Muslim India, Nationalism and Conflict in India, are these two volumes comprised of articles written by a Punjabi journalist, which are put together under the express orders of Jinnah, as claimed by his political secretary Matlubul Hassan. And they go on to therefore then push this idea that Pakistan is not going to be a weak state, it's going to be a viable state. So in this regard, they focus on Pakistan's natural resources, its infrastructural assets, its strategic location, also kind of push this idea a great deal that a Muslim population which would be free of both British and Hindu subordination, a population which is healthy, soldierly, given the fact that this region provides a lot of soldiers to the Indian army, would indeed be a very viable, indeed rather a very powerful state. I'm not going to go into the arguments pushed forth in these two volumes, but as this debate then enters into the public sphere, what you see is that a whole host of other people, propagandists, political operatives, functionaries of the Congress, the Muslim League, independent observers, all begin to participate in this debate on the whole question of Pakistan. The critiques of Pakistan begin fairly quickly, soon after indeed the Lahore Resolution is passed. And in this regard, what needs to be remembered is that the critiques are mostly by the ulama belonging to the Jamaat Ulama Hind, the premier organization of the Indian Muslim ulama. And these people are at the forefront of pushing back against the Muslim League's idea of Pakistan. We need to take these ulama much more seriously because they are working in a context in which the Congress leadership itself is largely in prison, especially after the Quit India program, which the British government comes down upon very hard. Most of the Congress leadership is in prison, and in the absence of a Congress leadership taking over this message of anti-Pakistan, if I may put it, it is these ulama who fill the breach. In this regard, I would like to kind of highlight one particular critique of Pakistan, which is brought out by a cleric who comes from the province of Bihar. His name is Maulana Sayyid Muhammad Sajjad Bihari. But of course, Sajjad is somebody who has had the bulk of his education in UP, and he is one of the alims who is part of this Jamaatul Ulama-e-Hind. The reason why I am bringing up these critiques is to also make it clear that the idea of Pakistan was fiercely contested within the Muslim community, and that multiple perspectives emerged on this question of Pakistan in the run-up to the partition. We may club the critics of Pakistan under the party of Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani, who is the leader of the Jamaatul Ulama-e-Hind. And Madani and his associates go on to push back against this idea of Pakistan that is put forth by the Muslim League. The first thing that Madani and his associates, Sajjad and others, do is to attack two fairly prominent reasons given out by the Muslim League as to why Pakistan should be created. Because the one thing I kind of forgot to mention while talking about the Muslim League's counterblast to Ambedkar is that they don't just highlight the viability of Pakistan, but also provide reasons as to how it is going to succeed. In this regard, one of the things which is tom-tommed about quite a bit in the UP especially is what comes to be known as the hostage population theory. It is therefore argued that once partition happens, there are going to be substantial minorities on both sides. Muslims in Hindu India, as the Muslim League always calls it Hindu India, and indeed Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan. And it is believed that the presence of these minorities on both sides would work as a kind of security guarantee, so that if there is violence against one set of minorities on one side, there would be a fear of retributive violence on minorities on the other side. And the Muslim League functionaries, from the top leadership of the Muslim League to the functionary on the ground, is not averse to kind of pushing this idea of the hostage population theory being a fairly strong security guarantee to secure the lives, property, interests, rights of minorities on both sides. The second, of course, the corollary of this is indeed that if Pakistan becomes a sovereign state, well, it would intervene to protect the rights of Muslims who would be left behind in Hindu India. It could do it diplomatically, it could do it militarily, whatever it is. Now, to attack this idea, Madani and his associates first denounced the hostage population theory for its threat of retributive violence against religious minorities. No Muslim government, they argued, could commit atrocities on their own peace-loving citizens simply because Muslims were being persecuted elsewhere. Such a policy was contrary to the Sharia, which expressly enjoined Muslim leaders to treat their minorities with fairness and compassion. Moreover, they noted that even if it did not conform to the conventions of international relations, nor did this theory have any historical precedents. In this regard, they pointed out that Muslims around the world had long been oppressed by British imperialism, and yet Turkey, the foremost Muslim power in the world, had not once retaliated against its own Christian subjects. As regards the efficacy of the threat of war against India, against Hindu India to protect Muslims, therein, they again noted that Turkey had not come to the aid of Indian Muslims even during the 1857 mutiny, which was eventually crushed by the British. Indeed, neither Turkey nor any other Muslim state had mustered sufficient courage to serve even a diplomatic notice to Britain for the atrocities it had committed against the Indian Muslims, leave alone go to war for their sake. More recently, Madani and his associates pointed out, Albania had been violently annexed by Italy, and yet all that the Muslim states of the world had done was to passively watch the show. But the most prominent example that was highlighted was that of Palestine, whose Muslims had repeatedly narrated their tale of woe to the Islamic world, especially petitioned Muslim governments to fight, to help them in their fight for freedom, and also given a call for jihad to overthrow imperialist domination. Yet it was pointed out that the Indian Muslims and the Islamic world had largely ignored Palestinian entreaties. Moving to more practical arguments, they noted that the population figures of Pakistan would be 60% Muslim and 40% Hindu, while that of Hindustan would be 10% Muslim and 90% Hindu. In Pakistan, the Muslims would thus have a precarious majority, while in Hindustan they would continue to be a very feeble minority. The Pakistan government would therefore not be able to target its own non-Muslim minorities in response to Muslims being persecuted in India. In the light of these examples, they warned that Muslims could not afford to live under any illusion or hope that hypothetical theories regarding their protection would ever be put into practice. In this context, they also criticized another idea, that of population transfer, which some sections of the Muslim League leadership were also considering in pursuance of the principle of national homogeneity. And in this regard, it needs to be remembered that in his very first press conference after the Lahore resolution, Mr. Jinnah, of course, went on to claim that some degree of transfers of population would have to be considered. So this has to be considered. While pointing to the practical problems involved in such mad policies, they argued that such moves would sound the death knell of Islam in India as well. After all, Hindu India contained primary sites of Muslim culture and civilization, had a number of mosques, shrines of saints, graves of martyrs and ancestors, than indeed in all of Pakistan areas. The Deobandi ulama also attacked Pakistan as an economically poor, militarily feeble, politically impotent and administratively feckless entity that would collapse and be forced to meekly return to the Indian fold sooner rather than later. They reiterated that the revenue deficit provinces of Sindh, frontier province, Baluchistan would drag Pakistan into an economic quagmire, besides noting that Pakistan had few natural resources and little capital to extract them. Poo-pooing the plans for Pakistan's economic development, these ulama, involving invitations to foreign and even Hindu capitalists to invest in Pakistan, these ulama argued that such a policy would only enslave Pakistan to either Hindu or foreign capital. Providing examples from different parts of the world, they pointed out how Iranian oil fields had come under the control of foreign oil companies, and had to be nationalized by Reza Shah to free Iran from their domination. Even Ibn Saud, they pointed out, had cancelled similar agreements with oil companies to gain their freedom. Equally importantly, it was noted that since that Pakistan would have an impact on the economic future of Muslims left behind in India, since Pakistan was going to be founded on the basis of religious difference and communal hatred, it was possible that after the partition, Muslims in India would be deprived of capital and loans and reduced to penury as a result of discriminatory economic laws that an indignant India would legislate. Through this economic critique of Pakistan, besides the critique of the hostage population theory and other reasons given by the Muslim League, the ulama sought to demonstrate that they were not just men of religion, but keenly aware of issues relating to modern economics and the ramifications of domestic politics as well as international relations. The ulama also lambasted the two-nation theory as fraudulent and concocted by the British to divide the Indian nation and perpetuate their own rule. In this context, they reminded fellow Muslims about the Arabs who during World War I were incited by the British to revolt against the Turks according to the ideology that they were a separate nation and they had been enslaved by the Turks. However, once the Turks had been defeated and ejected out of Arab lands, the British had reneged on promises made to the Arabs about their freedom, and the Arabs had thus passed from the control of the Turks to slavery under the British and the French. The Arab example therefore clearly showed how a powerful nation could be enslaved by inciting discord among its different communities so that they would demand a division of the country. They therefore appealed to fellow Muslims to avoid the trap of Pakistan, as it would only pave the way for the reconsolidation of British rule in the subcontinent. Finally, the Deobandi ulama attacked Pakistan as un-Islamic given the contradiction between territorial nationalism and Islam, denounced Jinnah as an infidel, Kafir-e-Azam as he's called, as he was famously a non-practicing Muslim who enjoyed his wine, smoked cigarettes, reportedly ate ham sandwiches, and seemed to be the last person who could make Pakistan Islamic, and also finally downgraded Pakistani territory as inferior when compared to the blessed land of India with its Islamic monuments, mosques, shrines, graves of saints and martyrs in the cause of Islam. However, if the ideologues of Pakistan had to contend with these critiques by the Deobandi ulama, making them vulnerable to particularly to the Islamic arguments against Pakistan raised by these Deobandi ulama, what I also try to argue is that an important strand of opinion within Deoband aligns itself to the Muslim League and comes out with theological defenses for the idea of Pakistan. And in this regard, a figure by the name of Maulana Shabbir Ahmad Usmani, and I think I wanted to show some images, but anyway, I forgot about it. It's okay. Maybe I'll show it to you after I'm done speaking. A critical figure here is whose work I highlight is this alim by the name of Shabbir Ahmad Usmani, an important figure who's kind of not been given his due place in the historiography on India's partition. This is the man who is the guiding force behind the passage of the Objectives Resolution in Pakistan's Constituent Assembly. He is the man who also presides over Mr. Jinnah's state burial after the private ceremonies have been done in Shia, according to Shia custom. The state burial is Sunni burial. And finally, of course, he is seen as Pakistan's first and last Shaykhul Islam. Now, Shabbir Ahmad Usmani is indeed an associate of people like Hussain Ahmad Madani and others who have aligned themselves with the Congress. But he breaks away from the Jamaat Ulama Hind and the ulama supporting the Congress to create his own organization, the Jamaat Ulama Islam, which continues as one of Pakistan's two major religious parties, and aligns himself firmly with Muslim League and Mr. Jinnah. And Shabbir Ahmad Usmani, and I'll take the last 10 minutes to kind of highlight the arguments made by Usmani in the cause of Pakistan. And Usmani is somebody who kind of comes up with a defense of the two-nation theory and the idea of Pakistan. Usmani defends first the two-nation theory by claiming that, well, you can't argue against it since the two-nation theory was not the invention of any man, but as Usmani claims, its origins lay in the Quran itself. He pointed out that the final prophecy brought by the Prophet had deemed that the only valid classification by which mankind could be ordered was that between the Mu'min and the Kafir. The arrival of Islam therefore meant that all ideals of group loyalty, asabiyat, broke down, and all that remained among Muslims was an Islamic identity. And here Usmani quoted from the Hadith, Sahih Muslim, when the Prophet asked his flock, "What nation are you?" they did not reply they were Hijazi, Yemeni, Najdi or Qurayshi. All said in unison that they were Muslim. Usmani insisted that the Indian Muslims had always carried the revelation of their separate nationality in their hearts and never gave it a second thought until a hue and cry was raised with this theory of composite nationalism or Muttahida Qawmiyat, which is of course raised by the Deobandi ulama who are associated with the Congress, who are for an undivided India. Now, this theory of Muttahida Qawmiyat or composite nationalism, which is backed by Madani and his supporters, claimed that this idea had a glorious precedent in the treaty signed between the Prophet and the Jews in Medina. But Usmani went on to attack this view, arguing that the Jews and Muslims did not constitute one nation in Medina. And referring to the treaty, he noted that the Prophet had explicitly declared in it that in case of a dispute between the Jews and the Muslims, its resolution could only happen through the final judgment delivered by God and his messenger. And here, Usmani pointedly inquired whether the votaries of Muttahida Qawmiyat or composite nationalism would be willing to accept such a condition in which the Quran would be the final word in any dispute between Hindus and Muslims. Complementing his defense of the two-nation theory, Usmani emphasized Pakistan's great historical significance by underlining the uncanny parallels between the creation of what he called the first Pakistan in Medina by the Prophet and the ongoing struggle for the creation of Pakistan in the subcontinent. He explained that the Prophet had not established Pakistan in his native Mecca, but had instead migrated to Medina, as he was convinced that Pakistan could be established only in an area where the Muslims could practice their religion with complete freedom and without any external hindrances, for only in such a land could the Muslim community develop to its fullest potentiality. He thus underlined the cardinal importance of establishing Pakistan in a part of India where the Muslims were in a majority and could set up their own state based on Sharia, completely free from both Hindu and British domination. Usmani made it clear that Pakistan would indeed be an Islamic state in which the ulama would have privacy in matters of passing legislation, administering law, besides regulating the religious and cultural life of the Muslims. At the same time, though, he warned that the Islamic State could not materialize overnight, but could only emerge out of a process of gradual evolution. In order to defend this approach, Usmani noted that even Medina had reached its crest in only a gradual way. And as he used this metaphor, just like the night withdraws slowly and the light of the day spreads, just like an old chronic patient takes a step towards health and does not at once become healthy, in the same way Pakistan is a step in the direction of our national health towards our high noon, but a gradual step. Usmani also noted the unprecedented unity and cooperation between the followers of the Prophet during the creation of Pakistan in Medina, between the Ansar and the Muhajirin, and found a similar unity developing among Indian Muslims. The Muhajirin from a province such as UP, from which Usmani himself hailed, were sacrificing their lives for the formation of Pakistan, even though they themselves were neither its inhabitants, nor did they indeed intend to permanently leave their homelands. Usmani therefore declared that their sacrifices would not be in vain. Just as Medina had provided a base for Islam's eventual victory in Arabia and the wide world beyond, Pakistan would pave the way for the triumphal return of Islam as the ruling power over the entire subcontinent. The whole of Hindustan would thus be turned into Pakistan, just as the Prophet had turned all of Arabia into Pakistan. Usmani also defended Jinnah against attacks, besides clarifying the role of the ulama in a future Pakistan. Asking Muslims not to be upset by reference to Jinnah as the great leader, he declared that the term simply meant the tallest among them in the field of politics. But the question remained whether an alim or a cleric could lead the Muslims better than Jinnah. Usmani answered this question with the help of a metaphor. He explained that when the famous American wrestler Zbyszko came to India, Gandhi was not sent to fight him, neither was Jinnah. In the same way, since Jinnah and Gandhi were not quite wrestlers, and indeed an Indian wrestler by the name of Gama had been sent to confront Zbyszko, since he was an expert in the field of wrestling. In the same way, Mr. Jinnah was the best expert when it came to the question of representing Muslims during complex constitutional negotiations. Muslims needed to be eternally grateful to God for having given them such an honest and peerless lawyer as Mr. Jinnah. But here, Usmani made it clear as to the fact that Jinnah's task was limited to tackling the British and Congress on constitutional negotiations, and more importantly, that the role of the ulama would begin once this phase was completed. Here, Usmani employed another telling metaphor. He noted that when Muslims from India went on Hajj, they usually boarded ships skippered by English captains. When this ship carrying Hajis reached the vicinity of the port of Jeddah, it stopped well short of the port itself, given the many treacherous shoals and underwater rocks which the English captain of the ship was not competent to negotiate. At this point, an Arab mariner known as the pilot came from the shore to the ship to take charge from the English captain and safely guide the ship to the port so that the pilgrims could disembark and then step on the Holy Land. Mr. Jinnah, Usmani concluded, was the English captain who could take the Muslims only up to a certain point. After that point, an expert in Sharia was required, and it is here that the ulama would fulfill their duties. But till the point that Pakistan was achieved, the closest possible cooperation between these two personnel was essential, and Pakistan as a project would be unsuccessful if such a cooperation was lacking. Now, Usmani, to kind of conclude, did not just confine himself to making Islamic arguments for the creation of Pakistan, but also sought to bolster his thesis with secular arguments for Pakistan, but at the same time providing them with Islamic reference. He too echoed the celebration of Pakistan's geo-body, its role in uniting the entire Islamic world into a separate bloc, besides protecting Muslims left behind in Hindu India. Lauding the hostage population theory, he tersely asked, just like we are worried about our minority in Hindustan, don't you think that the Hindus are worried about the 3 crore Hindu minority in Pakistan? To emphasize this point, Usmani narrated a legend from Islamic history. He recounted that when a Christian government was reigning in Rome, Constantinople, a Christian soldier once slapped a poor old Muslim woman. The woman in her terror began to scream for help from the Abbasid Caliph Mutassim, and at this, the Christian soldier slapped the woman again and asked her whether the Caliph, riding on a white horse, would come to take revenge upon him for assaulting her. This little episode, Usmani claimed, gradually reached Baghdad and finally the ear of the Caliph himself. On hearing the story, an indignant Mutassim resolved that he would not step into his palace unless the old woman's cry for help had been answered. He then ordered all the white horses in the region to be requisitioned at whatever price they were available, raised a powerful army and attacked Constantinople and won a great victory. The wretched soldier who had assaulted the old woman was captured and presented to the lady by the Caliph, who declared that Mutassim had come to her aid. A sovereign Pakistan, Usmani concluded, would confer similar advantages. Nobody would dare to molest Muslims in Hindustan once Pakistan came into existence. Now, these arguments for and against Pakistan came to a head during the elections of 1945-46, which were dubbed as a referendum on Pakistan. Nehru sought to push back against the rising tide in favor of Pakistan during his intense election campaign with newer arguments. He dismissed a small state like Pakistan as anachronistic in an emerging world of large states, federations, confederations, and international government. Nehru further claimed that the coming of the atomic bomb made the demand for small states like Pakistan utterly absurd. Finally, an exasperated Nehru bluntly asked his listeners at a public meeting in Lucknow, the capital of UP, "What kind of a stand do you want? Would the Nawabs of UP migrate to Pakistan, leaving behind their zamindari and talukdari?" His chief lieutenant in the UP, Rafi Ahmad Kidwai, was blunter. "We Muslims in these provinces would become aliens if Pakistan is established. Are the Muslims of UP ready to share the burden of administration, or remain aloof and be treated like the Kabulis, the Chinese, and the Japanese with no rights?" The time had come to tell Jinnah frankly that the Muslims did not want Pakistan in which either they would have to become aliens in their own country or would have to leave it altogether. These efforts were in vain as the Muslim League won a landslide victory in the UP, capturing 75% of the popular vote in these elections. The two nation states theory seemed to be more convincing than indeed the idea of an undivided free India to the electorate in this context. Thank you.
Pass the microphone, and I ask questioners to speak closely into the mic so people over there can hear you.
Thank you for the presentation. I was struck by a couple of things. One is the references, many references to the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, both for advocates and people who are opposed to the idea of Pakistan. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about specifically the population exchange, the reference to the population exchange in Turkey and Greece. Thank you. And how first of all how it was read as a successful potentially exchange. And also the idea of the sick man of Asia, as the Ottoman Empire was referred to in Europe, and how the sick man of Europe, but then India as not wanting to be the sick man of Asia. I wonder if you could talk about that, and also potentially kind of tease out: are there references to the Ottoman Empire as an example? Or are they is it Turkey as an example, and are these distinctions made?
The Ottoman Empire, well, first of all, the question of population exchanges, of course, it's not a successful exchange, even in the case of Turkey, or it involves enormous amount of suffering on the part of people. Any population exchange is cruel, is brutal. But it's astounding, that Ambedkar, many of the Muslim League figures, do talk about it in terms of a possibility, which should certainly, is within the realms of possibility, and that this is something that can be achieved on a voluntary basis, spread out over a period of time, and also be managed by the two governments. The Congress, of course, the Congress leadership is, of course, it comes out with very strong statements against this whole idea. And, nobody does it more strongly than indeed the ulama. They point out that people are not like sticks and stones, who can be transferred from one place to the other. But whenever this question becomes, whenever this question is also raised, what you also see is on the side a invocation of this hostage population theory. So, for example, somebody like Usmani, while admitting to the possibility of these exchanges happening, of people migrating voluntarily, so on and so forth, also points out that, hey, it need not be the case, because there is, of course, these other populations on both sides. So you're not going to be threatened. Your security is not going to be threatened, because there is this other theory which is going to kind of balance, the two sides. The Ottoman Empire also, of course, is constantly invoked, because as the ulama, as I point out, they show how the Ottoman Empire itself is dismembered by the British, according to this theory of nationality, so that the Arabs and Turks are separate nationality. The Ottoman Empire is kind of invoked in another case also, in which these ulama who are aligned to the Congress, they argue that instead of liberating the 60 million Muslims in the majority provinces of British India, that is, the Muslim majority provinces in areas which would become Pakistan, and confining the 30 million who would be left behind in India to the slavery of Hindus, they say, let us all unite, align with the Hindus, because once we do that, British imperialism itself is going to collapse. And if British imperialism collapses, it will collapse throughout the world. And in that scenario, it will liberate the Muslims of the Islamic world also, who are much more numerous. So let us kind of undergo the slavery of the Hindus and liberate our brethren in the wider Islamic world. Yeah? So that is another way in which the Ottoman Empire is kind of referenced. So yeah, I don't know whether I answered the question enough, but yeah.
So you offer a lot of various arguments that all sides of this debate gave: economic, social, religious, but you end with the electorate, voting in the Muslim League overwhelmingly. What view or what rhetoric do you think the electorate bought into? Was it the idea of an ideal Islamic State? Was it sort of the more realist arguments about soldiers and economic viability? What do you think the people felt was most important?
You have reports from contemporary observers on the ground talking about how both these ideas have gained currency, especially in the UP. So there is this civil servant by the name of P.W. Radis, writing in this district called Faizabad. He goes and meets weavers in his district and asks them, what is there in Pakistan for you? And they say, hey, if there is any hanky-panky done to us, there's going to be a retributive effect there. So it's the fear of this thing which is going to kind of take care of our security. Or, one of the reasons why the Deobandi ulama who are attached to the Congress, they push back against the idea of Pakistan. One of the ways in which they do it is to point out that this is not going to be an Islamic state. They point out Jinnah's contradictory statements in this regard. They point out that Jinnah himself is hardly a practicing Muslim. They also point out that, how can you have an Islamic state in which you have a significant minority, close to 40%, which is non-Muslim. So for all these reasons, the Islamic State also is simply not practical in the case of Pakistan. So both these ideas are being kind of talked about. They are being they're being actively considered in the UP. So I'm not sure whether, one more than the other. I'm not sure. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Did the Congress and the approach to its wider Islamic community to discourage? Did the Congress approach the wider Islamic community for any discouraging evolution of Pakistan? Or?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things what I'm doing is pointing out how these ulama who are attached to, the Congress, who are wedded to the Congress idea of composite nationalism, of an undivided India, they are the people who are spearheading the drive against the Muslim League's idea of the two nations theory and the idea of Pakistan. So yeah, these ulama, of course, actively take part in this whole process. Yes.
Thank you, Venkat. I don't know if this is on or not, but I have a pretty loud voice. I'm having difficulty distinguishing the intervention, I think, that you're making historiographically. And, I can see, where the Jalal thesis is put under pressure here. But I would think that in order to really, go around, perhaps, the issue of whether Jinnah did or didn't want it, to go around the issue of, the idea of Pakistan discovered in a state of distraction or absent-mindedness, that one would want to look precisely at people like that weaver. Mm-hmm. The weaver wanted to look precisely away from the realm of high political discourse and ulema and all those characters who we're very familiar with, to think about how traders are operating, how khanedars are operating, how agrarian systems of co-ops and all the rest of that, how those get involved one way or the other in these series of longings that you're mapping out for us. So I also will admit I haven't read your book. I just have had a terribly busy week. But and so this is genuine and a kind-hearted question, I hope.
Sure.
Can you just put it in higher relief what you think the key historiographic intervention is here?
Okay. I think Gail Minnow recently came out with a review of my book in H Asia, and I think she kind of put it somewhat aptly. She says this is history from the middle. You have the historiography on the high politics of the partition. You have histories from below, and this is history from the middle, looking at the debates on Pakistan, which happen in the public sphere. So what I'm saying is simply this: I'm not interested in the high politics, or whether Pakistan was a bargaining theory, whether it was a bargaining chip, or whether Jinnah wanted Pakistan or not. I'm not interested in that question at all. What I'm interested in is, how does this idea, does it remain vague, or is there some clarity and substance to this question? Does it remain a vague idea, an emotional slogan, or is this idea discussed, debated, fought over, thrashed out in some with some intensity, extensively, with some degree of sophistication? And I found I was myself taken aback and surprised when I saw the level of sophistication as far as this public debate on Pakistan is concerned, in which you have people discussing the territorial boundaries of Pakistan, its viability in terms of its economics, how it's going to be viable administratively, what is its role going to be in the international in the stage of international relations, what's its relationship going to be with India, so on and so forth. And this debate also, I feel, filters down, because one of the chapters I have in this book is about how newspaper readers are following this debate. And I was lucky enough to kind of pick up this discussion, which happens in the columns of this newspaper called Medina, which comes out of another Medina, which comes out of Bijnor in UP, in which in 1942 the editor of this newspaper opens the columns of this newspaper to readers, saying, send in your responses to what is it that you understand by this thing called Pakistan. Are you for it? Are you against it? And the editor claims that he receives a flood of responses from readers, and indeed he also posts letters from places as far apart as Chittagong in the east, Bombay in the west, and Raichur in the Deccan. And he picks up ultimately two most cogent essays, one by a chap who is opposed to the idea of Pakistan, and he serializes this over several weeks. Then, of course, there are brief responses to this essay, followed by a long serialized essay again by a supporter of Pakistan as to why we should create Pakistan. So what I'm claiming is that it does not just remain a vague idea or an emotional slogan, but it is kind of thrashed out fairly intelligently in the public sphere. And, if we are to take Chris Bailey's idea of there being an informational order in India, in a society with very low levels of literacy, but with remarkably high levels of political awareness and intelligence, to say or to kind of assume that all the action happens in these secret negotiating chambers is, I think, shouldn't be taken that seriously. And we also need to remember that any political organization or leadership, when it builds a platform, it goes with some fairly specific ideas to the people. And Mr. Jinnah and company, as also the Congress and its allies, are actively reaching out to the people, pitching in their arguments as to, why for or against Pakistan. And so what you have is a fairly informed debate on this question. So South Asians are not kind of walking into the quicksands of partition in a kind of sleepwalking into it, but there is enormous amount of discussion and debate on this whole question. Thank you.
Thank you for this really stimulating and interesting talk. I was struck by a kind of parallelism in a way between the pro and anti, in the sense that it strikes me that from both sides the arguments are nationalist / universalist, right? That there's a kind of vision where the local, the communal, the individual, the connected is being left out of the story. I mean, this is most clear about the notion that somehow people could pick up and move. Muslims could move to Pakistan, Hindus could move to Hindustan, as if they weren't living in places that mattered, worlds, communities, sets of relations, but that within these ideological frameworks, either nationalism or a kind of Muslim universalism, right, where it's all part of one thing, that they were ways of negotiating the problem, but also erasing the possibilities of what it might mean to live in a place, to be connected, to have relations. I'm just wondering if there's anyone who began pushing back less from these kind of macro ideological grounds than from a sense of you're imagining, as if we were simply movable chips, that we're not human beings that are connected in very particular ways to particular forms of land, particular kinds of relations, because that seems to gets lost in this story no matter who's speaking. And I'm wondering whether you found places that try to push on that.
This is a long 500-page book which I'm embarrassed to inflict on most people. If it falls on somebody, it could lead to a brain injury. So I'm only wondering what it could do if you were to read it. But in any ways, they do. Some of these arguments are put forth, from the viewpoint of the locality, and especially by the opponents of the partition, pointing out, local connections, that, our ancestors are buried here. This is where our shrines are. This is where our graves are. This is where our mosques, our monuments are. And, we are not objects who can be kind of, slotted hither and thither. So there are these arguments, based on, local communities certainly being made in the cause, especially in the rhetoric which is employed by the ulama who are opposed to the Muslim League and who talk about the whole idea of, composite nationalism. Yeah? So somebody like Hussain Ahmad Madani, claims that, his family has been here even before the Mughals arrived in India. Yeah? And, they have lived for generations together in this land. And even though, of course, he also goes and lives in Medina himself. Yeah? Medina comes up again here. He goes and lives in Medina and teaches. He's supposed to be a famous teacher of hadith in Medina. He lives there for about close to 15 years, if I'm not mistaken, comes back to India. And he kind of very proudly is a UP native. So these arguments are certainly kind of finding, some space, definitely.
Thank you for that talk. I have two questions. One, it seems to me, I think in response to Will's question, you kind of clarified very clearly the middle level analysis that you're doing with the debate on Pakistan. But I think there's a second argument you were making. It came across to me much more in your talk, maybe even than in the book, which is not just that Pakistan was actually abundantly imagined and not insufficiently imagined, but the way you presented the Usmani's role in Jinnah's state funeral and the way you talked about his relationship with Jinnah, it seems to me that you're also making an argument about an Islamic understanding of Pakistan as not being belated, but very early. And one of my questions about that is that in some sense that's a difficult argument to make because you can show that in UP. Right? You see the enormous debate between the Deobandi ulama, the ones for Pakistan, the ones against Pakistan. But in the way in which the post-Jalal arguments that people have made, like for example Sheikh or Faisal Devji, where Islam is a kind of empty signifier. It's that sort of an ecumenical Islam. It's an Islam that is not so tied to this Usmani version of Islam. But in tying your Usmani so closely to Jinnah, am I right in suggesting that you're saying Islam plays a role of just separation between Hindus and Muslims? Because the ecumenical Islam kind of hides the division between Muslims, right? I mean, it makes it possible for Shias and Sunnis to all have, the same sort of understanding. And if you think of the role of Western businessmen and merchants, the UP dialogue just doesn't seem to fit that. So is there anything in your public debate in UP where you're getting an argument either for and against, not from these religious lines, but a much more moral understanding of religion rather than,
Firstly, you do point out to traders, and one of the things I feel is that, especially between, after 35, the folks that somebody like Faisal Devji talks about, the Aga Khans of the world or these Bombay elites, they've ceased to matter. The Aga Khan is, seen as at best an irritant on all sides. So he may come, he may go, nobody really takes him very, very seriously. As far as the other question that you raised, the arguments of the more ecumenical nature, I think, are made by the folks in the Jamiatul Ulama Hind who kind of align themselves to the Congress. I think Usmani and company are using the arguments basically to call for a division. I'm not sure whether I understood your question or whether I'm addressing. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, yeah, okay. See, one of the things that Usmani himself does is he points out that this is something which can be decided later on. Yeah, or what is the shape of the constitution of, what the shape of, what constitution Pakistan will have, what kind of an Islamic state, what species of an Islamic state it is going to emerge as, that can is kind of kicked further down the road. That, okay, we will come to an agreement based on deliberations, negotiations between all the various stakeholders. Yeah, so there it could be the Deobandis, it could be the Aligarh people, so on and so forth. So Usmani himself is quite pragmatic in this regard. As he says, it's not going to happen immediately. What kind of an Islamic state it is going to be, how it is going to be, is something that we will do it in the future. But for the time being, we need to have a separate sovereign state for the Muslims where we will have sovereignty. This is also something which comes up, and I kind of point it out in one of my chapters. When the Muslim League is meeting in Patna in 1939 for the All India Muslim League meeting, there is this, the Deobandi contingent shows up and says, you need to pray together, and so the question emerges, who's going to be the prayer leader? And that is going to kind of bring up all kinds of, whether it's going to be a Deobandi, whether it's going to be a Barelvi, so on and so forth. And so Jinnah says, let's keep this separate. And then, of course, he's advised that, whoever you stand behind, you kind of stand behind whoever is the prayer leader, and the rest of the community will follow. And that is precisely what happens. So I think what the ideologues of the Muslim League are saying is, let's figure this out later as to what kind of an Islamic Pakistan is going to be. But it's vaguely going to be some species of an Islamic State. But that's not going to be done now, but later. Right now, we are only there for sovereign power. We want sovereign power, state power.
Hi, yeah. I just want to say thanks again for that that very finely textured reading of these debates. I wanted to push a little bit for you to say a bit more about what the debates themselves are generative of, perhaps in the aftermath of partition. And so another way of phrasing the question might be to say, sort of what is at stake in the idea of Pakistan being if not coherent, then at least substantive, as opposed to vague and sort of left undefined. Particularly at the moment of partition, why does it matter that these debates are happening? What comes after?
Well, that's a good question. One of the arguments which could be made is that these debates are not over yet. They continue, even in Pakistan. As to what kind of a state Pakistan should be. So the Deobandis may have a different idea. The Muslim modernists, may have a separate idea as to what Pakistan should look like, or what an Islamic State itself means. So the debates which begin in the 1940s, are by no means over. They kind of continue even in post-independent Pakistan. And indeed, I think the way these debates are going to be resolved is critical when it comes to the question of Pakistan's own self-identity or national identity.
So I have two questions too, and the first one is, I guess, related to the answer you just gave, Minnie, which was, they decided. Well, initially my question was there discussion of governance and of law and Sharia specifically, and it seems like over an internally differentiated Muslim population, it seems like they deferred that. So how does that bear upon your argument that Pakistan was, in fact, this fleshed out, definitive idea, if there was this element of deferral or delayed judgment and negotiation post? So there is this kind of important thing that's left out for later, and how does that impact your argument? And the second part is about Ambedkar and your discussion of Ambedkar, which is really fascinating. So how does, in your discussion of it, you say that he asks the question, or answers it rather, that Pakistan will be a nation or is a nation. So how does he define that outside of the Muslim League's category of, religion or two-nation theory? Does he kind of go into sources from below? So if this is a history of the middle, is Ambedkar doing something that he reaches down to see how ordinary, popular, sources, ordinary Muslims might be defining themselves through Pakistan or through an idea of Pakistan at this moment?
Yeah, to kind of take the second question first. No, I think Ambedkar basically is operating with the categories of the colonial state. Sees Muslims as defined by colonial laws. So Muslims are those who vote in these separate constituencies and who self-identify themselves as Muslims. So Ambedkar is, I don't think he is doing any kind of digging any further below arguments. As regards the other question, it's not like Pakistan is imagined down to the last detail. What I am claiming is that there is, it does not remain just an empty slogan or just an emotional slogan or a vague idea, that it is thought through in terms of its territoriality, its identity as a nation state, so on and so forth. So in some ways, what could be said is that in a way it is as or perhaps more sufficiently imagined than India itself. So it doesn't remain a vague idea. That's what I'm claiming, that there are all these debates on the question of of Pakistan's viability, its existence as a nation state in the world in a world comprised of other states, its role in that world. But the other thing to remember is that nations are also projects in the making. It's not like the project of nation building, is finished. It's a work in progress, and that is something that both the states of India and Pakistan have to deal with, even after partition itself. So for example, even in the case of India too, there are serious doubts about whether this is going to cohere, whether it's going to stick. So you have this American journalist in the 60s, Selig Harrison, writing about India's most dangerous decades. Or again, when Nehru dies, there is this question about, is this country going to stick together? Is it going to fall apart? Or at best, it will require a military dictator to keep it together. So the question as to whether a nation is kind of figured out to the last detail, I don't think that happens. But because I think nations are works in progress, or nation states are works in progress, and you need to constantly renew this bond.
Hi, thank you. Given kind of the oversized role that the Army comes to play later on in the formation of what is Pakistan, do you see any early indicators from, especially the Muslim portion of the Army Officer Corps at this time? We're kind of talking about pre-partition.
I personally haven't looked at evidence of this kind, so I really don't know.
When you look at these debates, in the context you looked at, if you bring in the position of Congress, okay, how Muslims were reacting to those. If you brought those, some of your conclusions would be different.
No, I think I did present, the Congress leadership, as I point out, after 42 till 45 is mostly in prison. And so it is the ulama, aligned to the Jamaat Ulama Hind, who are making all these arguments against Pakistan. So I'm not sure whether I answered your question, but I do bring in
Nehru's position. How maybe certain time
I guess, again, I have not looked at, I've kind of consciously moved away from looking at how some of the top leaders of the Congress or the Muslim League, how they are kind of politicking in this regard. So I don't even, if you look at it, my book has no reference to the transfer of power volumes. I have not looked at any of them. No. Yeah, I do talk about it in my book. I do try to look at how, some of these public statements, like for example, Mr. Jinnah in UP comes out, in 1941, he's addressing a meeting in Kanpur, and he says, I'm willing to allow the 3 crore Muslims of the minority provinces to be smashed for the sake of liberation of their more majority province brethren. And it then gets also translated into very florid Urdu कि भाई जिन्ना साहब जो यूपी के मुसलमानों के शहादत की आखिरी रज़म अदा करने को तैयार हैं और उसके ऊपर एक बहुत बड़ी बहस शुरू हो जाती है. तो हाँ, ये सब तो होता रहता है.
Okay, one more. Close.
My question is, it comes more out of sentiments, because I'm from Punjab and I'm not a student of history. I'm a cancer biologist. And so the question I have two questions. The first question is, if the top leadership of Congress and Muslim League, Muslim League, of course, started this idea of Pakistan, and if the top leadership of Indian National Congress had foreseen the emergence of Pakistan as an inevitable, event, do you think we could have avoided the bloodshed that happened during the partition? Because they agreed, if my knowledge is correct, on in 1947, just before the partition. So whether there could have been slow transition and we could have avoided the bloodshed. My parents have seen that. And the second part of my second question is, which I don't know if you will be interested to answer, that the idea of the separate identity for the Muslim, if I remember from my high school books, it was first time mooted by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. And later on, so what I was interested in to hear about Allama Iqbal, and especially in the context that Allama Iqbal, when he wrote Mazhab nahi sikhata, aapas mein bair rakhna, Hindi hai hum watan hai, Hindustan hamara, and later on he started talking about Pakistan. So what led to that transition in him? And he died in 1938. So that means the debate had started much earlier. And what led in his transition from a Hindustani to more of a Pakistani?
Shukriya. I don't think there is an inevitability to the partition. And as you rightly pointed out, in 1947, the June 3rd plan or whatever, when it is signed, that, finally decided that there is going to be partition. So there is no inevitability to it. I'm not arguing that there is an inevitability to partition. As regards, Iqbal or any of the other Muslim League figures, I think one of the critical experiences of, or one of the critical events is indeed, what happens post 1937 elections, which happened under the Government of India Act of 1935, and especially the experience that they have in UP, in which, of course, there is talk of a coalitional government between the Congress and the Muslim League, and that doesn't happen. The Muslim League feels that the Congress is trying to wipe out, any separate Muslim identity. And, so, most of the dramatis personae in this whole partition drama claim that, the path to partition is paved from the UP, because once these negotiations over coalitional governments in the provinces kind of collapse, that is when, the Muslim League kind of emerges and pushes back against the Congress. So, I think so. The sentiment which Muslim League, which is fairly strong in the Muslim League circles, is that in an undivided post-British India, the Muslims are going to be a permanent, impotent minority, given the fact that the Muslims only comprise 25% of the population, and they're going to be outvoted by the Hindus every time. So that becomes the Muslim League position, that we will be reduced to an impotent, permanent minority in India, and that politics is, politics ultimately happens on the basis of on communal grounds. People vote for candidates based on religion, so on and so forth. So that's the idea. Not that there might be interests in which you may have, according to which you may have cross-communal coalitions of different kinds. But so that is the experience of what happens post 1937 is quite important in the way the Muslim League kind of then takes up its different position.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Professor Dhulipala and all of you. And we shall reconvene, well, actually the reception is probably ready for all of us at this moment. So, in the Eisenberg suite.